All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We're still waiting for a few people to join us, but we might get started. I know everybody's time is very precious. So good afternoon, Vice-Chancellor, esteemed panellists who have joined us here today, and the many members of our UQ community who have found the time to attend this very important date in the annual Diversity and Inclusion calendar. We're very, very glad you could join us. Before I hand over to Professor Terry to formally open the event, and in terms of framing the forthcoming discussion, I think it's important to reference the words of feminist Simone de Beauvoir, that one is not born a woman, but one becomes one. Excuse my terrible French accent. We acknowledge that there are many pathways to and ways of enacting womanhood, and that becoming a woman is not always a linear or easy journey for some people. We believe that womanhood is not defined by chromosomes, biology or science, it's defined by identity. So while we'll be using the term woman throughout today's panel, this term includes everyone who is a woman, sometimes or all the time, or who experiences the barriers and challenges due to being perceived by others to be a woman. So I'll now hand over to UQ's Vice-Chancellor and President, Professor Deborah Terry, AO, to formally open the event. Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you very much, Dee, and good afternoon, everyone. It really is a great pleasure to be here this afternoon. And can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting. We honour their elders and their continuing cultural and spiritual connection to this land as we walk together on the path to reconciliation. Now, before I get into the reason that we're all here, obviously for International Women's Day, I'd just like to begin by saying that I hope everybody is doing okay, given the very difficult circumstances that we've all faced over the past couple of weeks. And I'm conscious that there are many, many people across our community who've had their lives turned upside down by the floods and by the freak storms. And I think our thoughts are particularly with those people who've been dealing with flooding in their homes and those who are now starting to rebuild their lives. And of course, events like these are very challenging, and especially so given that it comes on the back of all of the concerns and the disruption created by COVID throughout the summer. And also at the same time, our news bulletins are full of the horrific news coming from the war in Ukraine. And many of those news bulletins and the pictures we see each night expose the really tragic impact that the war is having on many women in Ukraine. And what we're seeing coming through those news reports and bulletins is their strength, as many of them are seeking refuge for themselves and their families in other parts of Europe. So when we take all of these events in combination, I do understand that it is really a challenging time for our community. But one of the things that does give me enormous hope is seeing the resilience of our community over the past few weeks. There have been amazing acts of generosity and an incredible feeling of friendship and support amongst those who have contributed to the recovery efforts. And today it does feel like there are many more people and much life returning to our campuses, and I think that really does help to restore a sense of normality. The other thing that's very encouraging is to see so many of our community who have chosen to join us for this event via Zoom, as we do celebrate International Women's Day. And I think we've had over 300 people registered for the event. That's over 300 people from across the university who've chosen to take time out of their normal workday to join us in this really important discussion about equality, about diversity, and about inclusion. So I do want to acknowledge and thank each and every one of you, and thank you for taking these issues so seriously. So although significant progress has been made in recent years, we all know that there's still inequality in our professions and in our workplaces. The key findings of the 2021 CEW, which is the Chief Executive Women Census report, I think speak for themselves. Women in Australia have been graduating from university in greater numbers than men for over a decade. In 2019, 60.4% of university graduates were women, which is, a really big improvement if you look over the decades. However, in 2021, so just last year, women held only 6% of chief executive officer roles in the ASX 300, the big listed companies, and 26% of positions in executive leadership teams. And if we go to our sector, on average, women occupy only 1 in 5 of the top leadership roles across the higher education sector. And of course, here at UQ, although improvements have been made, only 29% of our professors are female, which means that across the board, not enough of our women are having the opportunity to fulfil their career expectations or to lead, to influence and to help shape our institutions. Instead, the careers of still far too many women, I think, are being derailed by long-established structural barriers or deeply embedded cultural factors that work against the interests of women. So events such as this, and they're being held all over the country and the world today, and days like this are critically important. And the theme of International Women's Day for 2022 is a really important one. It's called and referred to as Break the Bias. It's a really important theme because it is an invitation for us to come together to discuss the structural and cultural barriers that are still preventing so many women from reaching their potential. Cultural prejudices about gender roles, as we all know, in our society are deeply embedded. And this applies not only to stereotypes about men and women and what they should do and where they fit in terms of childcare responsibilities and a whole range of other areas, but also to our willingness to acknowledge and call out the unconscious biases that work so powerfully against change and the achievement of equality. And it's these biases that we all know must be addressed if we are to see genuine progress. And unless we do that, we'll continue to see what Julie Bishop so frankly referred to as male deafness in an interview that she did with Andrew Denton. In her words, if you're the only female voice in the room, they just don't seem to hear you. And the consequence is that young women won't be prepared to tolerate such environments, and nor should they. Which is why I think as leaders we must be held accountable for our gender diversity targets, and we're going to hear from Dee around that in a moment. But we also have to ensure, we have to do much more than that. We have to ensure that the detailed work that we need to do, and we are doing that at UQ, but we do it to address the complex gender pay gaps which we know exist in our organisations. We must refuse to accept recruitment shortlists at all levels in our institution that are not sufficiently diverse. We must accept invitations to be part of panels, task forces or conferences only when there is a balance between male and female participants, what we at UQ call Merle's Pledge. And in some areas, as we have done recently at UQ, we have to have the courage and the foresight to consider female-only recruitment processes. And we've been doing that recently in some areas at UQ. Because as the reports from top global consulting firms reiterate year after year, it's those organisations that have greater gender diversity in their broad leadership teams that are the most successful. And that shows up in their bottom lines and their financial results. But I think it's more than that, and it's because organisations with diverse leadership teams at all levels are more innovative. And there's lots of data on that. They're more resilient. They're more likely to attract talent. Talented people want to come and work at those kinds of organisations. And they're more able to successfully navigate the complex ethical and social licence to operate challenges that I think will increasingly face us all as we look forward to quite an uncertain future in many areas. And as a quote I often refer to, as David Morgan said when he was CEO of Westpac, and I always think it's a very powerful quote, it's not just a compliance issue, it's not a diversity issue, it's not a social responsibility issue. Yes, it's the right thing to do, but it's also the strategic thing to do for all of our institutions. So what I want to do today, and I'm obviously going to hand over to Dee in a moment, but obviously thank everybody for being involved in today's session. It's really good that we are able to come together as a community on International Women's Day, that we are able to really reflect on the theme for this year's International Women's Day. But I would also like to acknowledge and support the fact that we need to recognise that many women face compounding barriers to their career progression. That's not only due to gender, but due to other biases associated with their skin colour, their cultural or linguistic background, religion, age, disability, gender identity, or sexual orientation, to name just a few. And this is really the topic of our panel discussion today. How do we break the bias for people who are contending with bias, either conscious or unconscious, on multiple levels? And I'm really looking forward to that panel discussion because it features a number of our very esteemed colleagues from across this university, and I really thank all of you for being involved. But I think it will broaden that discussion. It's important, obviously, on International Women's Day to think about it in the context of gender, but I commend you, Dee, for bringing together the much broader discussion, because that question of bias goes to a whole range of different ways in which we can think about ourselves, and it's often that compounding effect of bias that has such detrimental outcomes. So I'm going to pass back to Dee in one moment, and she's going to talk us through the progress that the university has been making in terms of implementing the actions that we included in our SAGE Athena Swan Action Plan. And Dee will show that we are making some progress. And I quoted one stat in terms of the proportion of our professors at UQ who are female. We have improved over the last few years, and that's a good thing, but there is still much more that we need to do. So we do need to place a greater focus, obviously, on our Athena Swan Action Plan to make sure that we do stay focused on those actions that we've agreed to in order to achieve the goals that we've put into our own strategy and our operational plans. So once again, thank you all for participating in this session. I hope you enjoy the discussion, and happy International Women's Day to you all. Over to you now, Dee. Thank you very much.
Hi, Meg and everyone. Thank you so much, Debbie, for those inspiring words. And I'd like to acknowledge your effort as the Vice-Chancellor, your passion for diversity and inclusion, the way that you're reshaping the narrative about diversity and inclusion, and your involvement in our Senate Committee for Equity, Diversity and Inclusion has really reinvigorated all of our efforts at UQ. So it's wonderful having such a senior leader be so personally and passionately supportive of the work that we do. So thank you very much. So I've been asked to give a very, very quick update about SAGE Athena Swan. We signed up to SAGE Athena Swan quite a few years ago. We were successful in getting bronze accreditation, which is the highest that you could get. Just want to put that out there, knowing how competitive everybody at UQ is. We got bronze accreditation on our first submission in 2020. And Nicole Barton, amazing Nicole Barton in the Workplace Diversity Inclusion team, has been working very hard project managing UQ's efforts to actually deliver on the very ambitious action plan that we submitted as part of that accreditation. So COVID has had a little bit of obviously a bit of an impact on our ability to sort of get traction in some areas, but we've still managed to achieve an awful lot in the last 18 months. I'm not going to bore you by going through all of these different initiatives and objectives, but only to say that we've been working really tirelessly to deliver against the ambitious action plan that we set for ourselves. And we've been doing this in a highly intersectional way. So we have been making sure that we don't just talk about women, we talk about women with disability, we talk about women who are in STEM disciplines, we talk about women in leadership positions, with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. So we really have, as a team and as a university, kept that very intersectional focus on the work that we do. And I think that's really reaping a lot of benefits. I think the chairs of all of our diversity and inclusion committees are on our panel today. I'm sure they'll talk about the fact that there's been a lot more cross-portfolio collaboration. There's a real energy around this space. And that's how we will get UQ to the next stage. In terms of kind of big ticket items that I think have made a really big difference, the Merle Pledge was really a fantastic way for Debbie to start her Vice-Chancellorship at UQ. People have taken the Merle Pledge, they're acting on it. I get lots of email about, I refused to speak at this event, it wasn't diverse, and they found somebody and now I will. And yeah, so the Merle Pledge is actually having a very real impact. We did some amazing Women Finding Success podcast series throughout last year and into this year. All of this information is available if you Google WDI-UQ or check our Sage Athena website. We've also done in the recruitment space some pretty bold and innovative things. Such as, you know, we have done women-only recruitment rounds for areas where there are very, very few women in a particular cohort to try and really, you know, ensure that we have role models and leaders and people for young academic women and students to look up to, and ensure that we're capturing the many benefits that diversity brings to the way a team thinks and the organisational culture and all of the things that Debbie so eloquently referenced. UQ's become an endorsed Women in STEM Decadal Plan champion, which has enabled us to network nationally with other like-minded organisations. We've done a lot of work on the performance relative to opportunity piece. We're trying to influence the next round of enterprise bargaining to make sure that our diversity and inclusion objectives and imperatives are factored into that. Lots of seminars, lots of engagements. We've looked at recognising women's service and often unsung service to various committees and the things that diverse women are obligated to do or feel obligated to do because they are such a rare person at UQ, and all of the extra kind of service workload that brings. So there's a lot. So I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, but I guess the big question that we have is, has any of this had an impact? I'm pleased to say it has. So if you look at the workforce profile for academic staff, you'll see that we actually have had a little narrowing of that very distinct scissor graph that occurs as women sort of move between level B and level C. And that's where we really start. It doesn't matter how many women are present at the earlier stages of academia, even in occupational areas or discipline areas where they're significantly overrepresented. There's always a scissor graph where women's participation drops off considerably and men's participation increases considerably. And we end up with some of the structural, organisational structural conditions that bring about things like, you know, gender pay inequity and a lack of role models and a lack of senior people on committees to ensure our thinking and decision making is really very informed and inclusive. So we have seen a narrowing of the scissor graph, but there's a lot more work to be done. In terms of professional staff, the workforce profile hasn't really changed significantly since we've been working on Athena Swan, but I do think it's important to notice, I call it the law of gender, and it's almost always holds true that it doesn't matter how many women commence in a occupational area, say for example teaching, which is highly feminized. By the time you start getting into those senior roles and the senior management roles, men will always be overrepresented relative to their representation in the cohort. That is seen in education, it's seen in healthcare, it's seen in other industries and occupations where women are overrepresented. So, you know, I think we may not have a scissor, but, you know, the fact that we end up at 50-50 is probably not where we should be relative to the cohort of women at this university in professional roles. So in terms of STEM, now Athena Swan initially had a very, very strong focus on STEM areas. They were basing that off a UK model. Australian Voices, including UQs, was very much about, no, we don't just want to focus on STEM, we want to focus on diversity and inclusion much more broadly. We don't want to just focus on women in STEM, that's too narrow for the work that we want to do. Thankfully, SAGE organisation has listened to that feedback, and the refreshed framework for Athena Swan is now incredibly inclusive of all forms of diversity. It's inclusive of men who are underrepresented in their relative cohort. And it really has become more of an overarching national framework for diversity and inclusion, which pleases us enormously. And they really have taken this intersectionality very seriously. But the original purpose was to get, higher numbers of women and more representation of women in those STEM areas. And we've been quite successful in that regard. And we've seen significant uplift, particularly in those senior academic roles at the more senior levels of academia. The senior professional roles has always been, for the last decade, it's been sort of around that, 48, 49, 51, 52%. So not a really big difference there. Gender pay equity, I talked previously about some of the structural barriers and challenges that we have as a university. Unfortunately, our overall gender pay gap is still in 2021 16.3%. We've got Terry Simmons on our panel. He's actually a national expert in gender pay equity. I'm sure he'd love to answer any sort of questions you have about national benchmarking. But we have made good progress. We are reducing the overall gender pay gap, but that progress is slowed by the way that we're structured. So really, until we start to see more senior women in senior roles achieving the same remuneration as senior men currently do, we're not going to be able to get that really big shift in our overall gender pay gap. Where we've looked at like-for-like gender pay analysis, and I have to say Nicole Barton is probably delivering the most granular and precise gender pay analysis in the country, right down to you're a level D and you're in this school and you've got this many staff and let's compare you to this other. So it's very, very granular. We've seen a really good shift in the number of like-for-like pay gaps. So as recently as 2018, we had 162 like-for-like pay gaps and 64% of those gaps favoured men. Last year in 2021, that had been reduced to 109 like-for-like pay gaps. And before you appear totally horrified, 52% of those actually were in favour of women. So we are shifting the dial on gender pay equity in areas that don't involve how we're structured. So that's really where we're at the moment. We're on our pathway to silver. Because of COVID, we've been given an extra year to kind of deliver on the action plan that we agreed to as part of our bronze accreditation. And our focus this year is identifying what we want to really prioritise for that next stage of accreditation, which is silver accreditation. I can announce we had a Gender Steering Committee meeting a couple of weeks ago, and the Gender Steering Committee endorsed that people with disability is going to be an area of focus for UQ going forward, which I'm delighted about. We've got some pretty good stats that show that people at UQ with disability and long-term illness do not have as favourable views of the organisation as people who have not indicated that they have disability and long-term illness. And I do think that this portfolio is a portfolio where we can really shine as a university. One of the things that will enable us to shine as a university is Associate Professor Paul Harper, who happens to be on our panel today, and who also has recently been appointed as Blind Australian of the Year, which is a phenomenal achievement. So that's a nice little segue, I think, into the next stage of this afternoon's panel, which is a discussion about all things diversity and inclusion with a focus on intersectionality. So in terms of format, if you have questions that you would like our panel to answer, you can pop those at any time you like into the Q&A. You'll see there's a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Just pop your questions in there. Our panelists, if they're not busily speaking or responding to another question, will jump in And they'll actually endeavour to answer as many of those questions as they can while we run the panel. If they see a question that they think, oh, I think the other panelists would like to engage on that, then they'll bring that to the wider group. So yeah, pop your questions in there. And of course, after the panel, if you think of something or would like more information, we'll provide contact details for how you can access that information once we get towards closing the panel. All right, so let the games begin. So I'll start with my first question, which is looking at some of the intersecting barriers, challenges and biases faced by women from different diverse communities and the compounding nature of those barriers and challenges. So I'll start with you, Paul, our esteemed leader of UQ's Disability Inclusion Group. So Paul, drawing on your expertise and your lived experience and your activism in the field of disability inclusion, what do you see as being the major intersecting biases and challenges faced by women with disability? Thanks, Paul.
Well, good question. Well, 2021, Marsha Devlin published a fantastic book, Beating the Odds, a practical guide to navigating sexism in Australian high universities. Now, in chapter 4, she says that some women have a moment when they notice most of the professoriate and leadership positions are held by blokes, men. Now, Marsha's book is amazing, but if it was written by a woman with a disability, that moment would never have come, because a woman with a disability has no illusion that there is equality. They know their needs will not be met. There are no senior leaders, for example, in Australian higher education with a disability. I published just a few weeks ago in Times Higher Education with Book Soups about that there are no senior leaders, that's DVCR, Vice-Chancellor level, in higher education with a disability. So for a woman with a disability, they experience all the inequalities experienced by women. They experience also all the inequalities experienced by people with a disability. They also experience all the inequalities because they are a woman with a disability. For example, have you ever thought of starting a family? With that, have you ever been asked inappropriate questions? If you have a disability or there's a disability in your family, you get asked such inappropriate questions. My wife, for example, was asked if she should have a child because her husband, that's me, was blind. Now, women with a disability have many more disadvantages in this space than women generally. So they're not just exposed to pressure not to have a family, but women with a disability are not provided the same support to have a child. So medical appointments may not be held at every clinic, so they might have to go to a specialist clinic. This means it's harder to get help. Practically, this means more time off work to get that help. Now, if you have a child with a disability, daycare centres very rarely have disabled parking. And if they did, it's so common for that sort of parking to be taken by people who don't really need it. And many daycare centres don't have proper parking that's effective anyway. And so that means it's harder for women with a disability to get to the parking. So that means they're not just parking, they can't just park anywhere, they've got to park up the street. It's very hard to get access to daycare centres, which means, again, that's harder to get into work. Now, there's many more examples I can give, but we've been only asked to give a few examples before flipping back to the wider panel. So I might flip it back to Dee. And again, thank you for such a kind introduction.
Thanks, Paul. Just if you wouldn't mind elaborating, the D&I team have done a little bit of research around sort of biases that might impact people with disabilities' access to employment and the way that can impact their sort of, the entire sort of recruitment process. Would you care to speak a little bit about that from your perspective?
Well, a very simple thing is, if you have a disability, in the job interview, people often want to know how you will operate with a disability. So if they ask that question, then you spend time in the job interview answering it. If they don't ask the question, then people might leave wondering whether you can do the job. And so what I've always done is, when I have a job interview, which I haven't had one for a while because I've been blessed to be at UQ since 2011. But if I have an interview where they don't know me, I go, can I please have an interview that just deals with any disability related questions you have? So then the disability is dealt with separate from the job interview.
All right, thanks, Paul. So I'll flip now to Professor Nina Mitter. So Nina is the chair of the university's Cultural Inclusion Council, which is a new strategic committee for diversity inclusion that was stood up, I think, was it last year, Nina? Look that up.
Yes.
And Nina's been working very closely with Tanya Lutfi from WD&I, who's been an absolute rock star in getting, a strategy developed, measures of success, an annual reporting framework for inclusion, because this actually was a little bit of a gap, I think, in UQ's approach, particularly from the workplace diversity inclusion. I think the student space does this very well. But Nina, would you care to elaborate on some of those intersecting biases and challenges that might be faced by women from a cultural and linguistically diverse background?
Thanks, Dee, and thank you, Paul, because Paul, as Dee, you mentioned, this has given us an opportunity, that intersectionality, and I was talking to Paul about Employ My Ability program just last week. So this is all happening place at the moment. I'll start, Dee, the answer to your question by recounting a personal story now. 2 years back, my daughter, who was doing her internship in a hospital, calls me and says she wants to quit medicine. So this is a phone call that I get in the afternoon. And I asked why, and she said that she is doing rounds with a white male nurse, but because of her XX chromosome and extra dose of melanin pigment, which I've given her, every patient is presuming that she's the nurse and addressing the nurse as the doctor. So this brings home to the point that it is still happening, and it's there, and it's not just about gender inequality. It is about race, color, culture, language, disability, sexual orientation, and how all these factors intersect. And women of color is not just a biological definition, as you mentioned as well, and Debbie mentioned as well. The concept of intersectionality, as we are talking about, it was actually developed by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And she cites a court case as she developed this intersectionality case, that a group of African American women argued that they were refused a job on the basis of their race and gender, but they lost the court ruling. The company was not found guilty of discriminating based on race because they had hired African American men to work in the factory. They did not discriminate based on gender because they had hired white women for office-based roles. So what the court failed to consider was that intersection of race and gender. And Australia is a culturally and linguistically diverse nation, and proud to be at UQ, which is really a culturally and linguistically diverse place. But studies indicate that especially called women have experienced exclusion, isolation, communication challenges, lack of validation, and failure to receive due credit. The bias that men take charge and women take care needs to change, especially for women from ethnic backgrounds. They are judged as being either too hard or too soft, never just right. They're either seen as competent or light, but not both. Their efforts may be recognized as doing, but not leading things. So meaning women spend, and I do that as well, part of everyday life repeatedly proving sometimes that they too can lead. So these are some of the biases. And another challenge called women face is that subtle kind of discrimination or microaggression. For example, the comment that you're really well-spoken or articulate, as though that's an unexpected attribute. The looks sometimes which you say, you don't fit into this conversation, or an insensitive joke about your culture. So I believe that we are continually walking a tightrope between fitting in and feeling authentic. I can go on. As Paul said, we have a limited time. So I would like really to end with a quote saying here that a woman with a voice is by definition a strong woman, but the search to find that voice can be remarkably difficult. Together, we can create a gender equal world, and feminism isn't about making women stronger. Women are strong. It is about changing the way the world perceives their strength. Thank you, Dee.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nina. Insightful and inspiring as always. I think we all know people that come from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds who, after trying to even get an interview for a job, anglicize their name, and suddenly, you know, they're getting the call up. And there's been some really interesting research by Australian universities and Harvard University about the impact that race or perceived race can have on even just getting a foot in the door to demonstrate that you're capable of doing the job. So thank you for highlighting that, Nina. So I'll now ask the same question to Professor Tracy Bunder. Professor Tracy Bunder is a very active member of our Gender Steering Committee. She's involved in a lot of very high-level strategic committees at the university. And she's one of UQ's most experienced Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders. So Tracy, I know that we've spoken about this, and you've been wonderfully willing to star in our equity mandatory training videos and speak about this, but we'd really appreciate your perspectives on the intersecting biases faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. So if you wouldn't mind sharing your thoughts, that would be great.
Okay, thank you very much, Dee. Thank you for the invitation to the panel. And I just want to give a big shout out to all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members of the UQ community who may be online listening. And I'd also like to acknowledge the various countries where we are located today. As a Ngugi Waka Waka woman, that's a really important cultural practice that we engage in. But I also recognise the number of committees throughout the university who also engage in that particular practice. In the spirit of International Women's Day, I also want to acknowledge the matriarchs within my family who taught me to have courage and to be able to stand up, because they themselves were very fearless women. I think one of the really interesting situations that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women find themselves in is this contradiction. So on the one hand, when we name ourselves as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we are recognising that we are the first peoples of this country. And we are the descendants of the very, very first peoples of this country. But then at the same time, we are the minority within our own country. And so what happens to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, and I always find this really interesting, is that we can be, as Paul has said and as Nina has said, we can be not seen and not heard. And that isn't the way in which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women were raised. We have specific roles within our communities, and we take those roles quite seriously, and we have enormous responsibilities when we take up those roles. So to be rendered invisible and also silenced when we step into non-Indigenous spaces is really quite traumatic for us. And I find it interesting, particularly when you can be forgiven as a non-Indigenous person if you don't recognise an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. And I'm not necessarily wanting to sort of make claim that to be an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person, you have to, be dark-skinned. But when you do have that beautiful cafe latte colour or beautiful chocolate colour within your skin, how can you possibly be rendered invisible? within an organisation. It's really quite obvious to me that there is a beautiful person standing in front of me who has different melanin. And so therefore it becomes very easy to be able to see that person. So one of the things that's really important, and Professor Bronwyn Fredericks, as the Pro Vice-Chancellor Indigenous Engagement, prioritised this when she provided the training modules, the cultural safety modules from the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies for the university to be able to understand what cultural safety means. And it's really important for us to be in workplaces where we are safe. If we do not see that safety there, it is not unusual for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women to get a little bit cranky, because we are, after all, sovereign to this country. And so knowing that our peers, our colleagues, the management that we work with, our students are going to be respectful of our location is quite critical to our sense of being and belonging within that organisation. And I might leave it at that. Thanks, Dee.
Tracy, can I ask you to share your thoughts on what a safe, culturally safe workplace looks and feels like?
Maybe I can twist it around the other way. I find it really interesting that non-Indigenous cultural behaviour towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, you know, at first point of contact, right, asks us how come we're Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander. And I think it was Nina who talked about having conversations that position us to always prove ourselves all the time. I find that really interesting. I've been in situations where it left me wondering whether or not non-Indigenous people are well, you know, in terms of being able to, you know, constantly ask that question. And I think that's a very strange position to start from. So, you know, a safe environment for me is one that recognises and respects Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander positioning, however that may be named, and allows us to have our skills shine.
Thanks.
Yeah, sorry.
Tracy.
I was just going to say, without it necessarily being a measure of our Aboriginality, our indigeneity, you know.
Thank you so much, Tracy. I'm sure that we'll get questions that tease that theme out a little bit more. So I think the next person on my list of questioning was it Flick? So I'd like, no, it was Nancy. So I'd now like Professor Nancy Pahana to give her perspective on this same question. Nancy's been doing a lot of incredible work and research in the topic on the topic of age, and she's been really passionate about making sure that UQ became part of the age-friendly university initiative. Again, age, I think, was something that UQ didn't really have much focus on. So yeah, I'd really like to hear your perspectives on this. Nancy, over to you.
Thanks so much, and thanks so much for having me speak today. We're so fortunate in Australia to have one of the longest lifespans of countries in the world. Most people in Australia can look forward to living on average into their 80s. And yet, in a workplace environment, often companies are very reluctant to hire anyone over 50 sometimes over 40 in some industries. And in a recent survey nationally of Australians, 50% of Australians felt that their country was ageist. And what does ageism mean? It means judging someone just based on their chronological age. And one of the most pervasive stereotypes of judging people on their age is to think that all older people are alike, or they fit some kind of stereotype, they're conservative, they don't like technology, whatever. And this is really compounded when you think about women in the workplace, because you have age with a set of stereotypes, and then you have being a woman with an attendant set of stereotypes. And what you see is older women not being afforded opportunities, offered leadership roles, or even just invited to certain opportunities or events because there's oh, she won't be interested, she's older, she won't like that, she'll be confused by the technology. And, you know, it just goes on. And, you know, when you reflect on some of the stats about women in leadership roles, pay gap, these sorts of things, I think it is this intersectionality, because you're accumulating experience and wisdom. And moreover, most people feel on average about 10 years younger than whatever their chronological age is. So there you are, being 50, feeling 40, and just not even in the running. So I think that to wrap up, I think what we really need to do is we need to afford women more opportunities as they continue on their lifespan journey. And I'll end with a quote and a challenge. One of my favorite quotes in the aging literature is, "The afternoon knows what the morning never suspected." But I think for older women, we have to stop treating the afternoon like it's 10 minutes to midnight. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Nancy. It's always so interesting to hear you speak on this topic. I'm probably the exception in that I feel about 20 years older than my chronological age, rather than 10 years younger, but, you know, maybe that's just me. So thank you very much for those insights. So I'd now like Flick French, who's the Deputy Chair of UQ's very vibrant Ally Action Committee, working with, of course, Dino Willix to make UQ a more inclusive space for people by a U+ community. So Flick, I know that you've got some perspectives on this, and we look forward to hearing those.
Thank you so much, Dee. I'd like to start by saying I'm joining this panel today from a place of privilege as a white, lesbian, cisgender woman. So I want to pay my respects to queer elders, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who have fought for my rights. My identity is more accepted than many women of diverse genders, sexes, and sexualities. So I'm here today as an ally to transgender women, intersex women, bisexual women, asexual women, and every woman who identifies as queer. In the time available, I'm limiting myself to a few challenges we all face, not to specific challenges faced by specific communities, of which there are many. But currently, one of the biggest challenges facing LGBTQIA+ women is in mental health. It's important to note that our identities aren't causing mental health challenges. It's the discrimination and prejudice that we still experience. From a young age, we're conditioned to believe that our identities are abnormal, and this is reinforced by everything from magazines to films to debates in Parliament. The recent religious discrimination bill is an example that's been particularly damaging to our communities, with rampant transphobia visible in much commentary. I've lived with obsessive compulsive disorder my whole adult life, so the fact that almost 75% of LGBTQIA+ people have ever experienced suicidal ideation doesn't surprise me, but it might surprise you. For context, that's more than 5 times higher than the general Australian population. Our mental health outcomes aren't helped by biases in healthcare, where it's assumed women must be straight and cisgender until proven otherwise. Friends who happen to be trans are forced to find supportive GPs by trial and error, or if they're lucky, word of mouth recommendations from other trans people. And this bias in healthcare comes partly from a lack of education around sex and gender in medical schools. We know scientifically, as Dee mentioned at the beginning of this panel, that chromosomes and the external appearance of a body don't only fit into 2 boxes labeled male or female. There are more than 40 variations of sex characteristics possible in humans, meaning binary categorizations are and have always been outdated. Binary assumptions also lead to erasure of a lot of identities, particularly for women whose sex, gender, or sexuality doesn't conform. Bisexual and ace women are less likely to come out because of biases in both the straight and queer communities who claim that their sexualities don't exist. Intersex women are still subjected to invasive and unnecessary medical interventions against international human rights law when they are too young to consent. Ironically, we saw an example of these binary assumptions in the naming of a UQ event for International Women's Day, which was, without any malice intended by the organisers, actively excluding trans and intersex women. Thankfully, the name was changed, but these kind of microaggressions are experienced by women in our communities daily. And until we've educated ourselves out of them, we can't consider ourselves truly inclusive. And I know that goes for a lot of the groups that we represent today. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Dee. Back to you.
Thanks, Flick. Very articulately phrased. So I think that just leaves us with Terry. Terry Simmons has a very full dance card on International Women's Day. His area of research and area of national expertise is on gender, and he's a member of UQ's Gender Steering Committee and has been an absolutely invaluable member of that, just sharing his expertise in gender and increasing women's representation in STEM and in leadership roles and board positions. Terry's just been such a huge asset to the university. So Terry, I know that you probably have deep expertise in gender pay equity, working with the Australian Gender Equality Agency, but today we'd really like you to sort of discuss the biases impacting women's representation in STEM areas and STEM disciplines in academia. If you wouldn't mind sharing your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Dee. And I think the first place to start is that we aggregate 5 different areas into one acronym, which is STEM, and the experiences of women in each of those is different. So there's a danger even by beginning with that idea of STEM. But what they do have in common, of course, is each of those fields are dominated numerically by men, some more so than others, so particularly engineering, with only 14% of engineers being women. So that's the first thing I'd point out. But really it's around gender stereotyping and how that plays out. So there are persistent gender role stereotypes which play a critical role in the formation of bias faced by women in STEM. And the stereotypes outline from a very early age what boys and girls are supposedly good at and drive what then they become interested in, and ultimately drives the career choices that they make. So not only do we have gender role stereotypes coming up through our children, those stereotypes are also embedded in our organisation and societal structures. And they often reflect the male dominant view or the male dominant attributes that are preferable and the ways in which people should work generally. And I think what's disturbing is a recent study by Alice Eagley, which shows that those stereotypes have not shifted in 30 years from when she first did her study in the early 90s. So in short, stereotypes actually direct women away from many STEM fields to begin with, and particularly those dominated by men such as engineering, math and technology. And as a rule, male-dominated fields tend to be those with the greatest stereotype biases, both conscious and unconscious. And they act in sometimes very subtle ways, but they act to limit women's opportunities to gain valuable experience, to have roles on key projects, to access development opportunities, and even to access mentors and sponsors, which is so critical in science particularly. But it also, as we've already heard, impacts on recruitment and promotion, especially when you've got all male panels or all male key decision makers. So not only that, but male dominated fields tend to have structural biases against flexibility, against parental leave, against childcare, making it really difficult for those with caring responsibilities in those particular fields. the other thing is, in male-dominated fields, the informal social networks, which are so critical to getting social capital, often ostracize women, sometimes not deliberately, but by the very venues that they have, and by that ostracism that occurs just simply by not being invited to those things. But even on a practical level, so women in mining particularly have found that the PPE that's provided doesn't fit them. That the toilets are an afterthought, or the showers are an afterthought. And so the facilities that are provided for women in male-dominant industries, are very much second rate. So even simple things like that. So I think in closing, if we're going to see change, not only in women entering STEM fields, but having an equal opportunity for success, we have to create an environment, first of all, where young women feel like they actually want to be attracted to those fields in the first place, and that young men and all men view women occupying those roles as nothing out of the ordinary. And for that to happen, that's going to require a societal shift around gender role stereotypes that happen in the home, around the sharing of domestic labour, in our schools, around making sure that our curricula is not gendered, and particularly in the workplace in addressing those structures that are gendered and actually discriminatory.
Thanks so much, Terry. So I guess as a panel, we've talked about some of the barriers and challenges and biases faced by different groups of women. But I think what I'd like to do now is actually focus on what we can do about it. So some of the things like unpacking gender roles in Australian society might be slightly beyond the scope of what we can do in the here and now at the University of Queensland, although I know, Terry, you're trying really hard. But I'd like to ask all of the panelists if you could do one or two things, if we could do one or two things at UQ to make UQ more inclusive for different groups of women, and really attack some of those biases that we've talked about previously. What would those actions be? What can we do to fix this? What can we do to make it better? Anyone? Opening the floor.
The awkward silence. I'll go, Dee. I think there are a couple of things we can do, particularly for LGBTQIA+ women. One thing that I think is really, really important is education, because as I mentioned previously, my identity as a lesbian woman is something that's kind of a lot of people will go, oh yeah, okay, I know what that word means. But for a lot of people, there are certain aspects of identity that is kind of new knowledge for them. And that kind of thing, like the event that had to be renamed, was done completely out of, there was no malice intended. It was kind of one of those things that was just a small assumption. But when we make assumptions, we may not realize that there are other ways to be and to do things that are more inclusive. So it's a little bit about this universal design concept. And luckily here at UQ, we have fantastic training available in all kinds of different areas. I highly recommend the UQ Ally Workshop, which is somewhere you can learn a lot more about LGBTQIA+ inclusion specifically. And another thing that we can do is to support things like on UQ Giving Day. I know that a lot of different fantastic scholarships exist that help to increase the numbers of women who can access UQ from underrepresented groups. So I know that there's things like the Young Achievers program. There are scholarships for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, and we also have a bursary for LGBTQIA+ students who are experiencing financial hardship, which is particularly important at the moment, because we know that LGBTQIA+ women are significantly more likely to experience financial hardship and houselessness. And in the wake of these kinds of floods, it's really important that people are aware of these kinds of resources that are available to them, so that we can get more people at UQ who can then see themselves in the institution and rise up and address some of those lack of diversity in the very top positions.
That's fantastic, Flick, and some really, really good suggestions there. I think that anybody watching this panel would be able to avail themselves of that excellent training and take those actions. Would any of our other panelists like to Tracy? Fantastic. Tracy, yeah,
Yeah, 75 years later, still got to learn to turn on your microphone. Just a thank you to all the panelists, first of all. Within the university, we have cultural leave for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It may not necessarily be understood why Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people get cultural leave. It's 5 days of cultural leave. And as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, there are responsibilities, and I spoke about this in the beginning, that are quite critical to being able to maintain and sustain our communities. And so that cultural leave is really important, because one of the things that happens within the university, whilst on the one hand we have this sort of expectation for us to be able to perform professionally, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander professionally, as workers within the university, that's not who we are culturally. And so we need to be able to have that opportunity to actually disengage from an organisation that can work to assimilate us. And so we need to be able to have that time out so that we can maintain who we are as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, which is the first point in employing us anyway within the university.
So Tracy, do you see that as an education piece, like more that you can do? So we've got the cultural leave, but can we do more to actually help people understand what that leave is for and why it's important?
Yeah, I don't. I would be terribly sad and traumatized if an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander woman or man within or other cohorts are actually resisted by management or made fun of by colleagues because there is that leave that is available. That leave is really, really important for us. It is the opportunity for us to be able to maintain our identities on countries from which we come, and with our families and communities who are often, because of that matriarchal role, that women's role within our communities is really, really critical. Thank you.
Tracy. Nina, you wanted to add to the discussion?
Yeah, as you said, what are the few key things that we can do, one or two things. So I'll just maybe a little bit provide a brief on what the Cultural Inclusion Council, some of the steps we are already taking. So that's a really positive step in that way, that with the Cultural Inclusion Council, we are drafting, the UQ's first cultural inclusion strategy. And that has been done as a very consultative process with focus groups involved, with surveys involved, so that we can get that essence right. And some of the objectives of that cultural inclusion strategy actually address some of the barriers, can address some of those challenges and biases and barriers, because one of our objectives is interrogating the status quo. We need to interrogate that. We need to get answers of that status quo existing. Another objective is valuing and celebrating diversity. We need to create that awareness. When I came for the first time here, and that's a long time back, the only response I was getting was, yeah, India is a country of snake charmers and some temples, and that was about it. So, that creating awareness is very important. So I'm very pleased that we do have now a warm welcome program. We are developing a calendar which, has all the events and attach their significance to it. Not that that is enough, but that is happening. Some of the things that I would like to mention, which, are hearing from the panel today here, is getting a bit more granularity on the data that we are collecting. I know we presented the data on gender gap, pay gap, and how the gender roles or the academic promotion roles, and this was one of the question in the question as in the Q&A as well. Maybe it would be really nice to get not just gender, but what about culturally diverse group in that granularity? What about disability, as Paul was talking, or Flick mentioned? If we can get all these other factors, or Tracy's point of view, if we get that granularity, I think there will be more visibility as to what else can be done. And maybe just having the gender may not be enough, that would be one thing. And second point, and I'll stop there, is I would really like to see in UQ the young cohort involved in these conversations, the HDRs, the ECRs, the EMCRs. They are the ones who are the champions for tomorrow. And Nancy, not about the age factor, but I know that they are so much media savvy. They can start conversations on a much larger scale, bring that element together. So I think that having those young cohort involved in these conversations, getting them to be the champions to create that change would be a really good thing at UQ.
Absolutely agree with you on that, Nina. Nancy, if I can ask you, I know a lot of other organisations around the world are actually looking at women's life stages. So, looking at things like menopause and menstruation and the stages of life that that many women endure. I'll use that word, endure. Could you discuss your perspective of where UQ could do more in this to make our organisation more age-friendly for women at different life stages?
It's really interesting that you mentioned menopause, because that's going to be the subject of our next age-friendly committee, talking about that from an from an HR perspective, or talking about that this is something that is not really spoken about in the workplace. And I think that there is a lifespan approach. The age-friendly university is partly about a lifespan approach, right? So it is people being at different ages. So when we think of menopause, and people have menopause at a span of ages, right? So we have to be thinking broadly, not just about chronological age or assuming that everyone's at the same place. Similarly, I might say that if someone joined our faculty or joined a school in whatever role at a later point, because say they'd retrained in their career, now they may have different expectations than someone who could be the same age but was in the organization for say 20 years. So we have to really look at an individual level. What are the individual's goals? What are their unique circumstances in terms of caregiving? You mentioned menopause. There's a host of milestones or pressure points, and some of these are like menopause, unique to women, and we really need to be able to talk about this freely. I'm very, I'm so happy that we have this leave, for example, this cultural leave, but really disturbed that people might be discouraged from taking it. So that's almost doubly bad, because it's there, but then you're encouraged not to take it or made to embarrassed. And it's the same thing with women discussing menopause, right? It could be a very sensitive subject. So we need to be more sensitive and asking individuals about their own individual context, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nancy. Paul, you've had absolutely. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. Thank you. One thing I think is really important is to include people with disabilities in committees, in organising, and I think we're doing that a lot at UQ anyway, with the announcement you just mentioned with the Gender Steering Committee focus on disability. Disability is more represented across the university. But one area I think is when you arrange an event, for example, is there someone with a disability considered? Now I think about, imagine an 18-year-old girl in a wheelchair going to an event. She gets there, there's steps to get in, whether it's a student group or not. She finds a lift, gets up, and then halfway through the event, she needs to go to the restroom, finds there's no disability toilet available because of, that door's locked. So she has to go down, leave the building, go across, go to the library, then come back to the event. And it's just, there's great risks, and it's just not fair, essentially. So by including people with disabilities more visibly, when we have a really strong representation of disability in our student cohort, I think we're possibly I won't say we're the best because I don't have the data, but we're doing phenomenally well. I think having more people with disabilities present in committees and organisations, when organising things, it gives a disability perspective, and it helps reduce that sort of situation when they arrange their venue.
Thanks so much, Paul. That's a very practical consideration that I think anybody organising any sort of event or gathering can really kind of think through what might be the barriers for somebody with disability. So we've had some questions come up in the Q&A. All right, there's a lot of questions. I might start with this one. So I wonder if the panel could comment on the recent media release by Snow Medical, which I'm hoping everybody's seen in the morning dailies, about removing funding to the University of Melbourne based on a lack of diversity. For those who haven't seen the Campus Morning Mail, the Snow Foundation was quite angry that the University of Melbourne had all 6 honorary doctorates awarded only to men, and I think that's correct me if I'm wrong, panel, and has withdrawn funding on that basis. So would any of the panelists like to comment on that and any implications that might have for us?
I think there's a rise in that social responsibility of certainly of corporates in the way they approach work, not just philanthropy, but awarding contracts. I think Australia is one of the few countries in the world where we've got more than 30% women directors on our ASX 200s, despite all of our other poor gender stats. That's a remarkable achievement. We're only one of 3 countries in the world. But how that was achieved is really interesting, in that it was the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors who run our industry funds. And you may not know, but our industry funds control about 15% of our company's stock. So when they say, look, unless you have a woman director on your board, we're not going to vote for your next chair appointment, or we're not going to vote for your REM report, chairs all of a sudden start listening and going, we need to change. Now, I know that's the stick approach to gender equality, not the carrot, but I think we'll see more and more of that as we go forward. As corporates embrace D&I, they will be the ones saying to those who are not, look, we can't support you anymore.
Thanks, Terry. Any other perspectives on that question?
Yeah, no, that's good.
It's really positive feedback coming on the various chats and various forums on this news item. Like, people are saying it's a time that maybe this is a signal that, as I was saying, that you cannot maintain the status quo, you cannot ignore those social responsibilities. So the Snow Medical Association, they're saying they'll honor the commitment that they have done now, so that the fellowship, this term, because they were already done, but they are discontinuing any more fellowships because of not valuing the diversity and inclusion principles. And I think this sends a signal to all of us, that these things cannot go unnoticed. People are reacting, and therefore I think it's a good signal that way.
Thanks so much for your perspectives on that. I'll now take this question. I think this is a really good question, and I'm interested in the panel's response. Having men and other privileged groups come on board to ally women and marginalised groups is clearly so important to making sure diversity and inclusion can happen. And I think that was the premise behind, the whole male champions of change, which I'm personally not a massive fan of, but I know that other people are. What do we need to do to increase authentic allyship from those groups that may not feel this issue matters to them? And before I throw to the panel, I would like to say that we actually do have some fairly incredible men at the university who are very out and proudly allied, with the work that the Gender Steering Committee is doing and the work of other diversity and inclusion committees. Of course, we have 2 of those such gentlemen on the panel today. But what can we do to get more men involved in, changing the landscape and making our university a better place for women? Anyone care to comment?
Well, as a male, I'll take that. I had that question this morning in another panel that I was on, and I think it comes down to a couple of things. One is men don't have the lived experience of having experienced that kind of discrimination. So many genuinely uninformed. So becoming informed is critical, which means they need to be included in forums like this and invited by other women to be on these forums or in these forums. So whenever an opportunity arises with something like this, invite a male colleague, someone, and say, look, please come along, particularly senior male colleagues, and provide them with those opportunities to hear the stories. It's the stories that often change their view. Raw data is really important, but the case studies, the personal stories of women in their own faculty or their own school, and hearing those and realising, hang on, I'm hearing these, I need to do something about it. So giving them some kind of ownership. But it is about inclusion the other way.
Thanks, Terry. Any other thoughts?
I think the idea of the stories is really powerful, or when you see things happen rather than raw data. My wife's Indigenous, so I've seen some things that I didn't think existed in Australia firsthand. So that has changed my perspective. And if you looked at my research output, you probably also noticed it's also impacted upon where what I publish on.
Maybe I'll just add one more line there, is also, and I was hearing this in another panel in the morning, that we need to remove our biases as well, have that self-reflection. Sometimes we may have a bias as to, what would men do in such a committee or a situation. So I think that's another very key point, that we need to remove that bias from our side as well. And as Terry was saying, or Paul mentioned, to have that inclusion, have that storytelling, that conversation to tell our viewpoint without thinking of how they're going to take it and get involved.
Brilliant, thanks.
Yeah. Sorry, Dee. I would really agree with you on that, Nina. I mean, for myself, I did have a little bit of righteous feminist anger when I was like, there's 2 men on this panel for International Women's Day. What's going on? But it is so important that we have men who are allies from all of our communities involved in helping to lift women up. And it's also really important that we as women who might have more privilege in some ways help to lift up men who are in situations where they may experience greater issues. For example, trans men are one of the groups within the LGBTQIA+ communities who experience the greatest levels of poor mental ill health. So it's really important that we recognise that there are similarities and differences between our experiences and use those commonalities, and where we can really, as Terry and Paul said, bring those stories and those understandings to bear on other lived experiences.
Excellent. Thanks.
I might just interject that sometimes I think when you have men that want to be allies to whatever the question of the day is, it may also depend on their position in a power structure, because those people can also be silenced, in a group or in a situation where they don't have power. And so, having resources for people to know how to speak out or how to be supportive, even if they are silenced in some fora, I think is really important, because we really need all the allies across all of these areas that we can have.
So there's so many questions coming through now, it's hard to keep up. So one of the questions, and we might make this our closing question, and then I'll throw to the panel for any sort of last thoughts or last words. And I think this is a really good question. I wonder if there's any appetite about faculties and presumably institutes, portfolios having KPIs about the number of women and non-Caucasian people in leadership positions in schools. Is UQ ready for that type of a KPI? And I will defer to my fellow panelists on this one. What are the thoughts from the group?
We're doing pretty well in the Chancellor at the moment.
Yes.
Could I say that when we were working with Wajir on the employers of choice, that's actually something that's happening in all of them. that it's great to have the data and it's terrific to have great processes and policies, but without accountability and real consequences, often it goes nowhere. So having that accountability through KPIs and having them linked to progression is a surefire way to get people to actually do something.
Yeah, and I think that was part of the drive behind actually having that in UQ's strategic plan, is that, you know, by 2032, UQ will have 50% of leadership positions held by women. And there were also some KPIs pertaining to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representation. We haven't really delved too deeply on what leadership actually means as per the strategy. Does it mean all senior roles? Does it mean just, you know, decision-making roles? So we need to really unpack that. And I'm very much looking forward to that conversation and understanding what that means. Tracy.
And I'll just add to what Terence was saying, and that that information then should be made public. I would like to see KPIs associated with the university's work for country and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people associated with the various countries. I think when we give an acknowledgement to country, it would take that acknowledgement much deeper. How does my research, how is that associated with country? How am I caring for country? How does my teaching, how is that linked to country? You know, how do we make that much deeper as well? How is my business, my work business within the university, making the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, not just only women, but all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people better? Because I just want to remind people that as the First Peoples, we don't live as long as non-Indigenous people. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tracy. And while you were talking, Bronwyn Fredericks popped in the chat. We'd do better in the Chancellor if we had Indigenous people in non-identified roles too, across, you know, mainstream positions. And I certainly agree with that. And there's some agreement to that. So thank you very much. All right, so we're nearly out of time. I think from my perspective, I just love listening to the perspectives of this group of people. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. And I think people really enjoyed hearing from the different perspectives and finding out what's happening at UQ, you know, across the different portfolios. So I'll flick around the room. And if you don't, that's okay. But I'll invite each of our panelists if they'd like to share one closing comment or closing remark on this International Women's Day. So I'll start with you, Paul. You're at the top right.
Well, thank you for that. I think it's fantastic to see the intersectionality here today, diversity, and I think that's really, it brings a strength to promoting the equality for women, but also a broader diversity inclusion message that UQ is, we do diversity inclusion here.
Thanks, Paul. Over to you, Flick.
I think it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg who said there'd be enough women on the Supreme Court when it was all women. And I think maybe that's something we could be looking towards at UQ. Absolutely. Thanks, Flick. Terry.
I think whatever opportunity you've got to use your voice to progress this issue, take it. Don't be quiet. I think people have been quiet too long. I think the other thing I'd like to say is there's finally a push for a national strategy around gender equality. I think it's well and truly overdue. So hopefully we'll see that happen as well.
I think you should just whip one of those up, Terry, and hopefully everyone will jump on board.
Love to.
Thanks so much, Terry. Nancy.
I think that, you know, part of a longevity strategy is to be engaged with life. And so we really need to be affording all people the optimal ability to engage, you know, no matter what race, gender, sexual orientation, age, whatever, because this is what it means to age well.
Thanks, Nancy. Nina?
Yeah, one broad message which is coming out of this panel, of course, diversity in leadership roles, all kinds of diversity which comes out. And especially for women, I would like to say that a woman's sense of authenticity or conviction that her outward behavior is consistent with her inner values and identity is essential for her emotional well-being, productivity, and personal satisfaction. And we should acknowledge that and create an environment that allows that.
Thanks, Nina. And Tracy.
Thank you. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are bored with the status quo. It is boring. And UQ names itself as a leader in so many ways. And here is the opportunity to lead, not only for our university, but for all of the universities across the country. And so find that courage within and stand beside us and walk with us on our issues.
Thank you. And I think that's an absolutely perfect way to end our panel. Thank you, everyone. We look forward to seeing you around UQ as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dee.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Dee.
Dee.
Thanks, everyone.